We're taking a closer look at Southeast Asia today and how the Russian invasion of Ukraine so far away is impacting the region, and also how some countries have responded. Asia has seen far fewer people take to the streets to protest the war. Nothing like the hundreds of thousands who rallied across European capitals. Instead, most protests have involved Ukrainians and Russians abroad, such as this group in Bali, Indonesia. Indonesian President Joko Widodo has decided not to join the group of nations imposing sanctions on Russia. In general, the country prefers to stay neutral when it comes to conflicts, in part because the main domestic agenda is economic growth, and that means doing business with as many countries as possible. Russia accounts for less than 1% of trade with Indonesia, but about 16% of the country's military weaponry is from Russia. DW's Georg Mattis had the chance to speak to Indonesian Ambassador Nura Sawajaya, Director General for American and European Affairs. You can see how he's trying to walk the line.
Ambassador Mura, how concerned are you about the situation in Ukraine?
Well, we've been very consistent from the beginning. Before the war broke out, we are already sending a message that, everybody has to use the negotiation, peaceful settlement of dispute. And immediately when the attack began, so the president, has already been telling from his Twitter that, the war will not help and also will end to the suffering of humanity. And that is the reason why we are participating in the UN General Assembly.
So you mentioned the UN resolution for which
Yes.
Indonesia voted to
Yes.
condemn the Russian invasion.
Yes.
At what point would sanctions be something that Indonesia considers?
Well, what we are trying to do is, of course, to stop the conflict first and address the humanitarian issues, as well as create a safe passage. The safety of the civilians is very important. Addressing the issue of humanitarian is also very crucial, and that should be, immediate step that we have to take.
From an Asian perspective, what kind of geopolitical lessons do you draw from this conflict?
Well, very important lesson. First, conflict or military attack will not resolve the issue, will not benefit to anyone. And this is very important. Number two, the lesson that we learned, negotiation and peaceful settlement of dispute should be the only options for people to sit down. Number three, I think we have, stated many times, international community saying that multilateralism should be upheld, should be strengthened.
Do you think in terms of world politics, this will shift the focus on the Indo-Pacific from the United States, for example, rather towards Russia again?
I hope not, because I think the international community has to work together in unity. We have very important agenda for humanity. This is already affecting humanity all over the world. We are talking about pandemic. We need to also collaborate in unity. We need to also address the issue of economic reform post-pandemic situations. Well, of course, the war should stop, but then, we should not also, forget that the international community has a very important agenda that require us to be united, to be in a united front in order to address that pandemic. Without that, I think it will keep on going, and then it will also bring, tremendous impact to humanity. But certainly, I think the message of the Indonesian government is very clear. The war should stop.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, George. Thank you.
Not all countries in Southeast Asia have stood on the sidelines. Singapore, often viewed as Asia's version of Switzerland, surprised many when it decided to join sanctions. The Foreign Ministry's statement made clear why. Quote, "The sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of all countries, big and small, must be respected. Singapore takes any violation of these core principles seriously, as they are fundamental to the survival of Singapore, a small state." Joining us is Ian Chong, Associate Professor at the National University of Singapore with a focus on international relations in the Indo-Pacific. Ian, can you tell us more about Singapore's thinking? What struck me was the blunt assessment. We're a small country. We worry about big countries.
Right. So for Singapore, it's a long-standing issue about its size. We're small. So there's a lot of emphasis on international law, on juridical equality, because the governing party and, in fact, others in society sort of see having that sort of juridical equality, that protection of sovereignty, as a platform to raise Singapore's standing, to give Singapore a sort of equality with the larger powers. So that's certainly going to be an emphasis in all things that Singapore does. So before, when Singapore had to deal with the arbitral tribunal ruling on the South China Sea, it also emphasized these same sets of principles. It's quite key to Singapore's self-understanding and its positioning internationally.
But it's a country that has also generally avoided taking sides. So I wonder, how big a deal is this? And do you get a sense of whether citizens support the move?
Right. So given the considerations of size, Singapore tends not to want to get into big fights, but because this is seen, this issue of sovereignty and international law is seen to be key to Singapore's own interests. So it's not really taking a side apart from Singapore's own side, right? So in addition, I think to the question about how the public sees it, the public actually is sort of split on it. There's some who are quite critical. They would rather just avoid any trouble, not say anything, especially after Russia publicized Singapore's list of names of countries that included Singapore, saying that they were unfriendly to Russia. So there's some fear of repercussion. In addition, I think Singapore is talking about the sovereignty issues, but it's also interested in joining the sanctions because as a financial hub in Southeast Asia, it probably has more links to Russia and, of course, the rest of the world than its neighbors. In that sense, Singapore, I think, would be quite concerned if any secondary sanctions came and affected it. That would look really bad for Singapore's credibility as this actor that tries to be an honest broker, that tries to emphasize the rule of law. So it doesn't want to have that bad PR hit as well. So I think that's part of the consideration. We can't rule out, but of course it sounds much nicer to talk about these more grounded, broader, more abstract, noble even principles.
Now we're starting to see how this conflict will impact the global economy, the price of oil, for example. How do you anticipate the global supply chain, all that stuff, impacting Singapore?
So Singapore, even before the conflict, had been experiencing increasing inflation, like many other places of the world. So this current sort of spike in oil prices, also in food prices, is going to hit Singapore. I think that the full effects aren't felt yet, but they will bite. And I suppose it's a bullet that Singapore will have to bite. Fortunately, Singapore is wealthier, so it may be able to come up with subsidies and things like that for its own citizens. Although the slight wrinkle there is that it also recently passed a goods and services tax increase. So some of its citizens will really feel the pressure that come with inflation.
Ian Chong, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
The clearest impact the sanctions have, of course, is on Russians, and that doesn't just mean those in Russia. It also means those living and working abroad. Some have been living in paradise in Bali, but their situation is turning into a bit of a nightmare.
Konstantin Ivanov has savored Bali's warm climate and leisurely vibe. Things less common back home in Russia. But recently the vibe has changed. Withdrawing money from his Russian bank account no longer works. We've been completely stripped of our finances. They've been completely frozen, and we cannot use our finances at all here. Many Russian banks have been cut off from the global SWIFT transaction system. Visa and MasterCard services are suspended, and the ruble is in free fall. Only a few Russians here still have cash on hand. Recently, some Russian clients have changed their mode of payment. And there's been a decline in the number of Russian customers. We assumed it's because of the impact from what's been happening recently. and some of the Russian visitors' credit cards have been blocked. And of course, besides all the financial troubles, Konstantin Ivanov says he's concerned about his loved ones back home. Nobody wanted this war. We're all really worried. Nobody wants war. We all need peace.
We spent time looking at Southeast Asia, but we end this week the way we started, with China. Because of all the countries in Asia, China is the most important one when it comes to what it can do about a conflict thousands of miles away. It has not joined sanctions. In fact, it has reaffirmed its alliance with Russia, saying its friendship with Moscow is, quote, ironclad. At Beijing's annual congressional meeting on Friday, Premier Li Keqiang delivered this anodyne statement.
The current situation in Ukraine is indeed disconcerting. We should do our best to support Russia and Ukraine to overcome difficulties, conduct ceasefire negotiations, and reach a peaceful outcome. We support and encourage all efforts to resolve the crisis peacefully. The top priority is to prevent tensions from escalating or even getting out of control. There is consensus in the international community and all parties for this. China calls for maximum restraint to prevent a large-scale humanitarian crisis. China has put forward an initiative to deal with the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and has started and continued to provide humanitarian assistance to Ukraine.
As this conflict deepens, will China change its position? It's something for us to keep an eye on.